So, good morning, everyone. Guten Morgen allerseits. Es ist 11 Uhr. Ich freue mich ganz außerordentlich. I'm very happy to say welcome to all of you. Mit Ihrer Erlaubnis werden wir dieses Gespräch auf Englisch führen, weil unsere Gesprächspartnerin englischsprachig ist. With your permission, we will do this interview in English because Catherine, who is our guest today, is a native English speaker, and it's obviously easier for her to speak English. And also the people out there in the international audience might possibly have less problems in following us when we do this in English. So Catherine, a very, very warm welcome to you. It's a real pleasure to have you here today. I'm really grateful that you go through this exercise together with me today because you are the very first. How are you? Good morning.
Good morning. I'm well, thanks. And I'm also really excited to be in the very first Ars Boni podcast.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is obviously, I think, a really interesting initiative. And I think especially in this type of real emergency, having such a platform is also another opportunity to really sort of exploit if there are any good sides of this crisis and to try to reach as many people as possible.
Yeah. Could you perhaps start by telling us a little bit more about your background, where you are from, why you are in Vienna, what you're doing at the moment?
Okay, so I'm a PhD student at the Department of Innovation and Digitalization in Law. So my background, I'm half Italian, half English, but I grew up all of my life actually in Italy. I'm specifically from the region in the northwest of Italy. So this is Friuli Venezia Giulia on the border with Austria. And I studied in the Netherlands and in the UK, and now I'm really excited to be part of your team to carry out research and be part of the projects of the department.
Yes, and you are involved in the preparation of some of the upcoming projects, and you were already involved in preparing quite some of the proposals that we are constantly writing, and also now a little bit connected with one of the projects that will start shortly, right? So that's
yes,
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, but the reason why we talk today is probably not so much about the projects you are involved in. It's more about the situation all of us are facing at the moment. And perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about how Italy is doing at the moment on a factual basis. And then in the second stage, perhaps also on how the legal reaction on the situation was so far.
Of course. So I suppose many of the viewers know Italy has been the hotspot of the coronavirus emergency in Europe. And so considering that the crisis in China started officially from mid-January, the first cases in Italy were around the end of January, and these were still cases linked to tourists who flew to Italy. Whereas in early February in Italy, the real issue started when there was a real hotspot in an area of Lombardy and also in Veneto, where in 24 hours, many cases were discovered. And now in a time of, a bit less than 2 months, we have more than 115 infected cases and almost 14,000 deaths, with unfortunately more of 4,000 cases which can be considered serious or critical. So of course, I think I'm not stressing the numbers to emphasize how tragic the situation is, but I think that the legal discussion we will have later is also strictly related to how impressive negatively these numbers are.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any personal opinion on why the figures are so terrible in Italy compared to other countries in the world? So what is specifically different in Italy?
Well, of course, this is really personal speculation at this point. I suppose it's difficult to say, of course. Like, there have been studies showing that the cases in Italy of these hotspots were actually coming from Germany. So these are not people flying from China. So this is also quite an interesting development to see how actually this number increased so much in Italy and not so quickly in Germany. Mm-hmm. I think personally, I don't know, this is also a big discussion, but I believe that the Italian government really stepped in also to test a lot of people compared to other countries. So of course, these numbers show this. And in relation to deaths, unfortunately, it has been discussed a lot that Italy has a very high percentage of people which are in the high risk age group. So of course, this is an issue. And the fact that the hotspot was so specific in an area of Italy put a lot of stress on a few hospitals that, of course, could not handle the crisis anymore.
Yeah, but do you have any knowledge about whether the government was late in comparison with other governments in reacting on the situation, or whether people did not comply in a way that we know from other countries, or whether it's a mixture of both?
So I think one element that is really crucial in Italy is that being the first European country with such a crisis, of course, it couldn't really act in such a preventive way as could be seen, for example, in Austria, which really based all its measures on what was happening in Italy. So I think it was also problematic, also from a legal point of view, to take such drastic measures without really having an example of another country with a similar democracy taking such measures. So I think that's why the government took a few more days, I would say, to take such drastic decisions, and then realized that this was the only way ahead to actually slow down the infection rate.
And the situation at the moment is that the measures that are taken are quite similar to those that we know from Austria, right?
Yes, the measures are quite similar. I would say they are still a little bit more, like they are definitely stricter. And also in Italy, it depends a lot on specific regions, as health matters that are dealt also at the local level. So for example, the region where I come from, Friuli Venezia Giulia, they have actually some of the strictest rules at the moment in Italy, where it's not allowed to go for a walk or any other activities and going shopping or health necessity and so on. Whereas in other regions also more affected, this is possible. So it really depends also on the regions. So I think,
I mean, when you say that people are not even allowed to go for a walk, how is the mood in the population? Do the people comply with this, or?
Well, of course, not everybody's complying, but in general, I think it's also a cultural matter. But right now, I think the population, from what I couldn't see and what I can hear from my family members, of course, is that they are trying to comply as much as possible. There are cases that obviously they are not following the rules and they are fined for this. But I think, at least from what I saw, also, like this specific region has the strictest rules, is actually following them more than other regions that have less rules. So I think it's also that the population in Italy right now is very scared. So following the rules is also a way to protect themselves, obviously.
Yeah, I read something about fines, which are, I don't know, several years of prison if you leave the house, although you are under quarantine. So the fines are dramatically high. Is this correct?
Yes. So the measures are really strict, but then from what I could see from Italian media, actually, obviously, they are trying to refrain from implementing such burdensome fines and even like prison. But of course, another interesting development is also that they're finding a lot of illegal activities while checking for quarantine measures. So, but this is a different sort of, criminal matter.
Yeah. Do you think that one of the questions that I ask myself when I see how Germany is reacting, where I spent quite some time in my life, as you know, and compare this with Austria, I think one of the key differences that are there is that a lot of the measures taken are taken on a regional level and not on a federal level, which makes it very difficult to harmonize things. And I see Italy a little bit like this, right? So that every region is doing what the region thinks that is correct, and that makes it difficult on a federal level, because obviously people move around, and at least as long as they are allowed to do so, and do not stay in their region. Are there any thoughts about harmonizing measures more strictly than at the moment?
So at the moment, there are some decrees of the Prime Minister, which are like really setting up pretty strict measures, but then some elements of them are still left to the regions. So in the Italian constitution, there is a specific clause that in specific situations, the government can take over the competences of the regions, but this has not been invoked yet. However, I think there is a general understanding that at the moment the government has like more control than usual over the regions. And actually there have been constant debates between some regions, such as indeed the region where I come from, where stricter rules than the national rule were implemented. And yeah, but so far I think it's still pretty like harmonized without having to really rely on this special clause in the constitution.
And this nightmare that was in the media about a week ago, that there will be a second wave in the south with much more chaotic starting points there, in particular when it comes to public health. Is that developing? Or I mean, the last news I read about that is that the situation is clearly better than expected a week ago. Could you confirm this so far?
Yes, this is true. And of course, like in general, the health system in the south usually is considered to be struggling more than some of the entities in the north. So of course, the virus spreading to the south was really considered to be a major risk in Italy. So of course, I think it is under control, but then it is also like more cases are developing, and I think it could really develop quickly, as we have seen that in 24 hours it had such an impressive increase in the north. So, but I think obviously the measures, which are really strict, should help this. And yeah, of course there was also a risk, because when I think it was the 9th of March, when the lockdown situation in the north was announced, there was a really dramatic race to the south for a lot of people living in the north, where there were jammed trains. And obviously this is really the opposite of what was needed in that moment. So there was a lot of issues also, for example, students studying in the north, which went back to the south, and the parents got the virus. But right now, considering this was a few weeks ago, the worst of that should be under control, because of course now it's not possible to move from one region to the other anymore.
Yeah, but that's quite exactly what happened in Austria, in Tyrol, in Ischgl in particular, that, I don't know, 200 tourists left there right before the quarantine measures were taken, and they spread around the disease all over in Europe because they left without any measures undertaken then, and they even stayed overnight in hotels in Innsbruck and so on. So at least as far as I know, so quite frightening situation. So I mean, this is all obviously very, very new to all of us, and also to the legal system, and legal systems in Europe react very differently and not in a harmonized way. That's probably one of the key messages that I learned so far, that we are back into national systems also when it comes to legal responses. So how is the legal response at the moment on the whole crisis when it comes to either the public health system or limiting fundamental rights of the population, or both, if you want?
Yeah, so I think to simplify how it developed in Italy, it would be good to sort of emphasize that all these measures actually started from a specific area of Italy, which was named by the government also in decrees as the red area. And in almost a panic move, over 24 hours, the measures were extended to the whole territory of Italy. And I think in terms of freedom of movement and residence, it started with a quarantine, of course. So two types, let's say, of quarantine. One with active surveillance, where, of course, also the police might visit the affected people home. And this relates mostly to people who actually have contracted the virus or were in close contact to people with people with the virus. And I think from a fundamental rights perspective, this is effectively the same as an arrest, because like the restriction on movement, or even like these police visits at home, really effectively is the same. And the other, let's say, milder option was like a homestay based on trust. And obviously this relates to the rest of the population which has no virus or has not been in close contact with people with the virus. Then obviously there is a set of further preventive measures that were put into place, like in the first part of the crisis, sort of closing university and schools, canceling or prohibited sport events, and all sorts of like gatherings of people in public and private. And so I think these are obviously the measures that have the biggest effect on like day-to-day life for Italian citizens at the moment. But also from an economic point of view, the measure that was taken, I think, on the 11th of March to close all commercial activities, excluded those for primary necessities such as groceries or pharmacies, has also been really hindering the right to carry out work or the right to run a business, of course. And so next to, let's say, these preventive measures, then there have been laws trying to, I would say, limit the side effects of these rules, such as specific measures to limit economic damages from the measures, or like a decree that is called, I could translate it as a decree to cure Italy, which is really about making sure people in economic difficulties do not have to pay taxes for a period and so on. And I think the last measure is also quite, I mean, it's really important for the legal profession, and it's the suspension of judicial activities to a certain extent, which of course could also be seen as an encroachment of the right to a fair trial.
And are there, I mean, is there legal debate on whether these measures are legal under a fundamental rights perspective at the moment, or are also the lawyers, all of them, or more or less all of them, supporting what is going on? And what is your personal opinion on this? Do you think that this is still in line with the national constitution and or the European fundamental rights basis?
So I think in Italy, in general, in really specific legal circles, there has been some debate about the specific legal tools used to implement such measures, because these decrees can be sort of adopted, obviously, without the involvement of the parliament. And the risk, of course, there is a lack of checks and balances. So this has been questioned to be fully constitutional, but I think considering the emergency, in general, there is a consensus that these measures are in line with fundamental rights in Italy. Like, I have been following more in depth the whole discussion on the right to privacy, and maybe we can discuss this later.
Yes.
But I think considering the, of course, also fundamental right to health, the balancing so far, I think, is in line with European human rights standards.
Yeah,
and it's proportional and necessary and adequate.
So that leads me already to the debate that we have at the moment here in Austria, because one of the very few constitutional rights debates that I see at the moment in this country is about the proportionality of the possibly planned measures to survey people who are in quarantine or who could infect others. So whether or not there should be apps installed on mobiles, making it possible to trace people after infection. And that is, in my perception at least, the only area where we have some kind of debate at the moment in this country, whereas many of the other measures taken are not really challenged, at least not in the general debate from a constitutional rights point of view at the moment. Although you might, of course, also have the idea to challenge them. So is that, I mean, are there similar measures discussed in Italy at the moment when it comes to surveillance and privacy related matters, or is it obvious that those will not come?
Well, so surprisingly, I think, considering the developments in other European countries, there is no, let's say, harmonized acceptance of an application or some device to actually track citizens, where they're going and so on. However, so the Ministry of Technological Innovation and Digitalization in Italy has launched a special task force for the use of data for the emergency. So obviously they want to evaluate and propose data-driven solutions for both, like not only both actually, social, health, and economic issues related to the crisis. And so the task force is formed by 74 experts, and there is a specific subtask which deals only with data protection. And I checked the experts that are part of this subtask, and it mostly they are all academics, and they are covering fields like obviously IT law and data protection, but also health law, constitutional law, and human rights law. So I think this is a really good aspect of the whole initiative. And so they included a fast call, which is looking for mostly apps for assistance of patients. And yeah, as you mentioned, as well, solutions for continuous tracking, alerting, and timely control.
And what's the role of this committee exactly? It's advising the government, or? So
there is this task force, which is supervised or within the competence of the ministry, with experts in like specific IT fields or even economic aspects. And well, it's not clear, of course, from the outset what exactly this subtask on data protection is supposed to do. But what they say is that everything that is to be done in this task force has to be in compliance with data protection, and this team ensures this is carried out correctly.
And it's in a way independent, meaning that it's academics being part of this. It's not political parties or stakeholders. It's independent academics.
Yes. So I think the leader of this team is an academic who is already part of the ministry as like the expert on IT law related matters. And the rest, I just checked the names, and they're all academics in different universities, covering most of the universities in Italy.
But there's no app out there yet, right? So also on a voluntary basis, there is nothing that is used by the population, or are there any?
Well, clearly supported by the government, no, but there are some apps that have been used or are used. So for example, in Lombardy, where the biggest hotspot is, there is an application that is run by the civil protection, let's say, body in Italy, which is mostly an emergency notification application, where it's possible to complete on a voluntary basis a questionnaire where you can on a daily basis inform the body about your symptoms, so that they can trace the development of the virus or see whether there is a new area with a possible new critical hotspot, for example. So I tried to analyze as much as I could this application, and actually, so the questionnaire is really voluntary, and you can still receive emergency notifications and so on if you don't fill it out. So I think, from my understanding, this would be freely given consent, so I didn't find this particularly problematic. Apart from this, I found another local initiative in another region, Lazio, where they have an app that puts in contact doctors and patients, so that obviously they try to reduce the risk of too many patients going, for example, into general practitioners' practices, and also some other private initiatives. So for example, in my region, there is like a company which developed an application where you can share your health status with your contact list, but this has not been approved by any local authority. So I think it's more hypothesis at the moment in Italy to have actual tracking of movements of citizens. But I suppose that from this task force, there will be a product that will do something similar to what has been discussed in Austria.
And do you share my impression that the role of Europe as a factor in this game is not really an important one in all the member states I'm aware of. And would you share this impression for Italy too? So
Well,
do
yeah.
you see people debating whether Europe should try to find a unified answer, meaning one app for all of Europe, or one approach to privacy matters or to fundamental rights matters?
Well, I think in general, so not only relating to privacy, probably, well, this is not really surprising maybe, but the lack of initiative by Europe has been the center of political debate in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this is also used by specific political parties that want to be against the EU in general. But I think overall the population has been feeling as if they have been abandoned, of course, by the EU. And actually, I think yesterday it was specifically, so the EU specifically said that they felt as if they failed with Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is obviously already a positive step in showing that in a moment of emergency, it didn't really provide that support that could have been provided in its position. And from a privacy point of view, I think, well, I also reading the opinion by the EDPB, I see this really as a minimum effort to not create obstacles in implementing such privacy measures, and to really leave it to national governments to see whether it's worth it to rely on public security exceptions and really go ahead without really having too much of an issue with data protection.
Yeah, I think I share that view very much. Yeah, and do you think do you have the feeling that the population has an issue with this, or I mean, probably the priorities are not really in privacy matters at the moment, but still, is there some concern, or are people mainly dealing with the day-to-day surviving they are they are needing to deal with, obviously?
Well, I mean, also seeing from social media activity and so on, I think there is a vast portion of the population that believes that even just like spending so many resources on assessing whether there is a privacy risk in this situation is a problem, and they believe that, you know, the right to health should just like outweigh completely any privacy concerns. But yeah, I suppose, as you said, like general population, they wouldn't really waste too much time being worried about the monitoring through a device, but just trying to get out of this crisis, especially considering the really dramatic economic situation that is affecting Italy in terms of job market and so on.
Yeah, the situation is, I assume, even clearly more serious than here in Austria when it comes to the economic impact, right? So
yes, yeah. I think it's also a matter of the duration of the lockdown, because if I'm not mistaken, now it's about a month or at least 3 weeks and a half. So this is with all the shops closed and so on. So of course, this is a lot of people are losing their job, and I think some of the legal considerations because of this are really struggling to make their way to the public, let's say.
And when it comes to the economic situation, are there any debates already whether, for example, public servants should not be paid, or whether companies who receive public funds as support should not be allowed to pay a given amount of money to their leading staff or something like this? Or is there a fundamental political debate about justice and equality already appearing, or not?
Well, of course, there are some measures that I think affect also the public sector in these decrees. So, for example, this Cure Italy decree. But in general, I mean, it wasn't really in the media much about public servants not being paid and so on. I think some of the measures that, well, this is not really to help the economic situation, but right now, I don't know actually whether in Austria there is something like this, but one of the clauses in Italy now allows the government to take private property, either movable or immovable, to help the health sector in general to deal with the crisis. So I think this is also quite a drastic measure.
Yes, obviously. And again, probably not now the time to debate whether this is proportionate and legal from a fundamental rights perspective. But there is perhaps a difference between such questions and the privacy questions, which is that those drastic measures which have an impact on the physical world can easily be replaced by standard procedures when we go back to normal. Whereas everything which is data related is much more difficult to get that again back to the starting point, and that makes, at least in my perception, the debate on data so possibly different from all the other fundamental rights that we need to discuss here. Perhaps let me, if I may, end from my side at least with one question, which is about you personally comparing the situation as you see it in Italy and the situation that you see in Austria, with a specific emphasis on the legal situation. Is there anything you would suggest the Austrians not to do what the Italians do, or vice versa? Would you suggest anything that the Italians do that the Austrians do not yet, what we should do here in this country?
Okay, so of course this is based on my personal experience, but so also from a legal point of view, I think the measures taken now by Austria are somehow harder to justify due to the fact that, you know, from a number perspective, it's still rather under control here in Austria. My personal opinion is that, of course, we should rely on the studies made on the whole concept of flattening the curve and so on. And to do this, you have to start as soon as possible. So I agree with having rather strict measures to ensure that contacts between people are limited as much as possible. I think, yeah, probably I would also follow what the government did, because I think it really gives an idea that it's trying to focus also on really elements related to the health of its population rather to purely economic consideration. And I think the situation that we have seen in countries such as the UK, where a lot of citizens were forced to commute to work because, of course, the government was rather behind in implementing measures. This is a situation that should be avoided. I think that citizens should not feel forced to sort of face the virus. And in general, I think probably what the Austrian government is doing is good. Of course, from a privacy point of view, I would be skeptical to implement really surveillance-based applications and so on without really considering the risk that, well, to a certain extent, it's a bad long-term standard where at the end of the emergency, there is no limitation on the processing of data or the data collected during the period of crisis. But I would say that in general, both countries are trying to do their best, and I'm not sure whether there is a better way to deal with the situation.
And perhaps one precise question on this. I mean, I find it quite interesting that you have this academic oversight board on measures, which we don't have at the moment here in Austria. I mean, there are all kinds of people advising the government, but there's no, at least to the best of my knowledge, there's no independent academic board bringing together people from the different disciplines officially in charge of giving advice. And when it comes to privacy, that would possibly be also interesting from a competence point of view, because we have such boards. There is this, I mean, there's the authority, obviously, then there is this institution which is called Datenschutzrat, and the parties have their points of view. So that would produce probably some follow-up questions about what exactly this body is doing. But the idea still is interesting. Is there, I mean, is this a new phenomenon in Italy? Was that
done just for this purpose now, or is this something that you have experience so with? Of course, this is actually not linked to the Data Protection Authority, which in parallel is obviously issuing opinions and guidances and so on. So from what I can understand, in general, so in the Ministry of Technological Innovation and Digitalization, they do have experts in data protection for, I think reasonably. But I think this specific subtask has been put together just for the sake of this special emergency task force of the ministry. And I think I also read that they're working for the ministry for free or so on. So this is really ad hoc solution, I would say.
Interesting. Okay, I think I'm through with all the questions that I have. I see in the chat that there are 2 or 3 comments about the situation in Poland and in Hungary, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to repeat that one of our guests next week, Anthony, next Friday, is Polish, so we will be in the privileged position to discuss this really in detail. I really want to thank you, Catherine, for this first really, at least for me, challenging ride. You mastered it, in my view, perfectly. I'm very, very grateful. Is there anything you want to say at the end to me and to the audience before I officially declare this closed?
Oh, well, this is quite a burdensome task. So again, also thank you, Nicholas, and the whole department team for helping us with the technical aspects of this. And I think this is going to be like a really interesting podcast for all the viewers. Keep tuning in also next week with 3 more countries. So South Africa, Argentina, and Poland, which I think every country will have some really interesting insights on the crisis. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. All the best to all our speakers, to all our followers. I'm sorry. Please subscribe this channel and keep in touch with us. It's a real pleasure to do this in this very difficult time. We would appreciate all kinds of constructive feedback via all channels that you find. Please use this. Have a wonderful day and have a very good weekend as far as possible under these difficult circumstances. All the best to all of you. All the best, Catherine, to you. And thank you again. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.